Across the Atlantic, Pacific, Arctic and Mediterranean, military submarines disappeared beneath waters that concealed accidents, fires, collisions, and unexplained final transmissions from crews operating far from rescue. Some vanished during wartime patrols and others during training exercises or routine deployments, leaving behind distorted sonar recordings, damaged wrecks, and official reports that never fully explained what happened beneath the surface. As you move deeper into these cases, you follow fragmented distress signals, Cold War investigations, failed search operations, and wrecks discovered decades later in dark sections of the ocean floor. Beneath the technical explanations and military secrecy, each disappearance reveals how quickly control could vanish inside submarines built to survive some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Beneath the North Atlantic, the vanishing of USS Scorpion, 1968. In the late spring of 1968, the North Atlantic carried an atmosphere that military crews had learned to treat with caution rather than romance, because beneath the cold surface of those waters moved dozens of submarines belonging to rival nuclear powers whose presence was often known only through fragments of sonar contact, coded radio traffic, or brief sightings that disappeared as quickly as they emerged. It was a period when silence itself had become strategic, and some of the most heavily armed vessels on Earth crossed enormous stretches of ocean without announcing where they were going or what they were tracking beneath the sea. Among them was the American nuclear submarine USS Scorpion, a fast attack submarine returning home after operations near the Mediterranean, carrying 99 men through waters increasingly crowded by Cold War suspicion. Long before the submarine vanished, however, there were already quiet concerns surrounding the vessel, scattered observations and technical anxieties that seemed minor in isolation, yet would later be examined with almost obsessive attention after the Atlantic closed over the submarine and left almost nothing behind except questions. USS Scorpion was a skipjack-class, nuclear-powered submarine commissioned in 1960, designed during a period when the United States Navy placed extraordinary emphasis on underwater speed and maneuverability. Its streamlined hull reflected the changing philosophy of submarine warfare during the Cold War, when submarines were no longer simply underwater extensions of surface fleets, but independent strategic weapons capable of tracking Soviet vessels, gathering intelligence, and launching attacks while remaining almost impossible to detect. Powered by a nuclear reactor, Scorpion could remain submerged for long periods without surfacing for fuel, allowing it to move silently beneath vast sections of ocean where conventional submarines would have struggled to operate continuously. Yet, by the late 1960s, despite its advanced design, the submarine was no longer considered one of the Navy's newest vessels, and maintenance concerns had begun appearing in reports connected to its condition. Some of those concerns involved the submarine's mechanical systems and structural wear accumulated through years of demanding operations. During an overhaul period at Norfolk Naval Shipyard in 1967, Scorpion did not receive the extensive modernization work that some officials believed was necessary, partly because of budgetary pressures and operational demands placed on the fleet during the Cold War. Internal Navy records later revealed concerns involving the submarine's emergency systems, including discussions about the reliability of certain valves and the condition of components connected to the vessel's propulsion and weapon systems. At the time, none of these issues were publicly regarded as signs of impending catastrophe. Military submarines regularly operated with ongoing maintenance needs, and crews were accustomed to working within highly controlled technical limitations. Only afterward would investigators and historians begin treating these overlooked details as possible warnings hidden inside ordinary procedure. By early 1968, Cold War tensions beneath the sea had intensified considerably. The Soviet Navy had expanded its submarine operations into the Atlantic and Mediterranean, creating an underwater environment where American and Soviet submarines often shadowed one another through dangerous close-range maneuvers that were rarely acknowledged publicly. Collisions and near collisions had already occurred between submarines belonging to rival nations, though many incidents remained classified. Within this atmosphere of secrecy and suspicion, submarines like Scorpion carried out missions that blended surveillance, deterrence, and strategic pressure, operating in regions where one mistake or mechanical failure could become fatal long before help arrived. In May 1968, USS Scorpion departed from the Mediterranean and began the journey back toward Norfolk, Virginia. During the patrol, the submarine reportedly observed Soviet naval activity near the Atlantic, including operations involving Soviet vessels around the Azores. Some later accounts suggested the submarine had been monitoring a Soviet task force, though the exact details of its assignment remained classified for years. What is certain is that the submarine communicated periodically during its return voyage, and nothing in the final official messages indicated immediate catastrophe. One transmission sent shortly before the submarine disappeared mentioned plans related to returning to Norfolk and estimated arrival times, conveying the ordinary rhythm of a vessel nearing the end of deployment rather than a submarine facing disaster beneath thousands of feet of water. Then the communication stopped. USS Scorpion was expected back at Norfolk Naval Base on May 27, 1968, but the submarine never arrived. At first, there was uncertainty rather than alarm, because delays in submarine communication were not unusual. Submarines often maintained radio silence for operational security, and atmospheric conditions could interfere with transmissions. Yet as the hours passed and no further contact emerged, concern spread rapidly through naval command structures. Families waiting for the submarine's return received little information, while behind the scenes, Navy officials began attempting to reconstruct the submarine's last known movements across the Atlantic. The disappearance occurred during one of the most tense years of the Cold War, only months after the loss of the Israeli submarine INS Dakar and the Soviet submarine K-129, both of which had vanished earlier in 1968 under mysterious circumstances. For some naval analysts, the clustering of submarine disasters during the same year created an atmosphere almost superstitious in tone, as though the oceans themselves had become increasingly dangerous for vessels operating in secrecy beneath the surface. In reality, submarine operations had always carried immense risk, but the sudden succession of disappearances magnified public anxiety about what could happen far below the sea where rescue was nearly impossible. Search operations for Scorpion unfolded across large sections of the Atlantic, but unlike surface vessels or aircraft accidents, there were no visible signs marking where the submarine had gone down. No oil slick large enough to identify the wreckage location appeared. No survivors emerged. The submarine had simply disappeared somewhere within the immense darkness of the Atlantic Ocean. The absence of physical evidence intensified speculation almost immediately, especially because the submarine vanished during a period when the United States and Soviet Union closely monitored each other's military activity across the globe. Rumours concerning Soviet involvement began circulating not only among the public, but within segments of the intelligence community itself. Some theories suggested that Scorpion had been detected and attacked by Soviet forces in retaliation for American surveillance operations. Others pointed to reports that Soviet naval units appeared unusually aware of the submarine's possible location after contact was lost. Certain intelligence observations reportedly noted Soviet ships operating near areas connected to the disappearance, fueling suspicions that the submarine may have become entangled in a covert underwater confrontation hidden beneath official Cold War narratives. Those suspicions grew stronger after revelations concerning acoustic monitoring systems maintained by the United States Navy. During the Cold War, the Navy operated an underwater listening network known as SOSUS, or the Sound Surveillance System, designed to detect submarine activity through hydrophone arrays positioned across strategic sections of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Analysts reviewing recordings from SOSUS after Scorpion vanished identified a sequence of unusual underwater sounds captured on May 22, 1968, around the estimated period of the submarine's disappearance. The recordings appeared to contain multiple acoustic events, including sharp implosion-like noises consistent with catastrophic structural failure deep underwater. The interpretation of those sounds became one of the most debated elements of the entire case. Some analysts believed the recordings represented the submarine descending below crush depth, where external water pressure became too immense for the hull to withstand. Others suggested the sequence of sounds indicated a more complex chain of events, possibly involving explosions or internal system failures before the submarine finally imploded. Because underwater acoustics can be extremely difficult to interpret with certainty, the recordings provided clues without providing resolution. Even decades later, specialists continued disagreeing about what the sounds actually revealed. Months after the disappearance, the Navy launched an extensive deep-sea search operation using advanced oceanographic methods rarely attempted at such scale before. The search area stretched across enormous sections of the Atlantic southwest of the Azores, where depths exceeded 10,000 feet. Finding a submarine under such conditions resembled searching for fragments of metal scattered across a mountain range hidden beneath total darkness. Oceanographer John P. Craven, one of the leading scientific figures connected to the investigation, played a major role in developing analytical methods used to estimate where the submarine might have gone down. Craven later became closely associated with alternative theories surrounding the loss, particularly ideas involving torpedo malfunction. Eventually, after months of searching, the wreckage of USS Scorpion was discovered in October 1968 by the deep submergence vehicle Trieste II and associated search teams. The submarine rested approximately 400 miles southwest of the Azores on the ocean floor, broken into sections and surrounded by debris scattered across the seabed. Photographs captured during the investigation showed a shattered hull lying in darkness beneath immense pressure, creating images that became some of the most haunting visual records of Cold War naval history. Yet the discovery of the wreck did not settle the central question of why the submarine had been lost. One of the most persistent theories focused on the submarine's Mark 37 torpedoes. According to this explanation, a torpedo may have activated accidentally inside or near the submarine, forcing the crew into emergency procedures that spiraled out of control. Some versions suggested a malfunctioning torpedo began running hot, meaning its motor activated unexpectedly, potentially causing the crew to attempt rapid evasive action or disposal procedures. Under this theory, the submarine may have turned sharply while attempting to avoid its own weapon before losing depth control and descending catastrophically. Supporters of the torpedo theory pointed to known concerns involving battery malfunctions and overheating risks connected to certain torpedo systems used during that era. John Craven strongly favoured aspects of this explanation, arguing that acoustic evidence and operational patterns aligned with a sudden emergency involving on-board weapons. However, critics noted that no definitive proof confirmed a torpedo explosion, and some physical evidence from the wreckage appeared inconsistent with certain versions of the theory. Another explanation focused on mechanical failure involving the submarine's trash disposal unit, which allowed submarines to eject waste while submerged. Some investigators theorized that flooding through this system may have caused cascading electrical and propulsion failures that ultimately doomed the vessel. Others proposed battery explosions, shaft malfunctions, or catastrophic flooding from structural failure. The problem with nearly every theory was that the wreckage itself existed under conditions too extreme for complete forensic reconstruction, leaving investigators dependent on partial observations, acoustic interpretation, and technical inference rather than direct certainty. The possibility of Soviet involvement never disappeared entirely. During the Cold War, both superpowers routinely concealed submarine incidents, intelligence operations, and underwater encounters from public view. Soviet submarines had previously collided with Western vessels, and American submarines frequently tracked Soviet missile submarines at dangerously close distances. The secrecy surrounding naval operations created fertile ground for speculation, especially because official information about Scorpion remained classified for many years. Some former military personnel and researchers argued that the submarine may have been sunk intentionally or accidentally during a confrontation with Soviet forces, perhaps involving torpedoes or collision damage hidden beneath diplomatic silence. However, no conclusive evidence proving Soviet attack has ever emerged publicly. Soviet naval records released after the Cold War failed to provide definitive confirmation of such an encounter, though gaps and uncertainties within surviving records continued fueling suspicion among some investigators. The broader atmosphere of distrust between East and West ensured that almost any unexplained military disaster could become entangled in theories of covert conflict, and Scorpion became one of the clearest examples of how secrecy itself could sustain mystery long after physical evidence was recovered. For the families of the 99 men aboard, the uncertainty became one of the most painful aspects of the disaster. Unlike conventional wartime losses where battle circumstances might eventually become known, the men aboard Scorpion disappeared into an environment that revealed almost nothing. Many relatives spent years studying reports, listening to testimony, and searching for details that could explain the final moments inside the submarine. Because the Navy never reached absolute consensus regarding the cause, the disaster remained emotionally unresolved in ways that extended far beyond technical investigation. The ocean floor where Scorpion rests also became part of another Cold War anxiety, involving nuclear contamination. The submarine carried a nuclear reactor and torpedoes equipped with nuclear warheads, raising fears about long-term environmental consequences after the wreck was discovered. Monitoring efforts were conducted over subsequent decades, though the extreme depth of the wreck complicated direct examination. The idea of a nuclear submarine lying fractured beneath the Atlantic added another unsettling dimension to the disappearance, turning the wreck into both a grave site and a lingering technological relic of Cold War confrontation. As years passed, USS Scorpion transformed from a naval disaster into something larger within public memory, a symbol of how much of the Cold War unfolded in darkness beyond ordinary visibility. Unlike wars fought across visible front lines, submarine operations existed almost entirely in silence, hidden beneath oceans where entire crews could vanish without witnesses, and where evidence often remained inaccessible even after wreckage was located. The mystery surrounding Scorpion endured partly because the disaster occurred inside that invisible world, where acoustic fragments, classified reports, and broken wreckage became the only surviving traces of events no one actually saw unfold. Even modern investigations have struggled to establish complete certainty. Advances in deep-sea imaging and forensic analysis clarified aspects of the wreck's condition, yet they did not erase the contradictions embedded within earlier evidence. Some researchers continued supporting accidental torpedo activation, while others believed structural or mechanical failure remained more likely. Alternative theories persisted at the edges of discussion, sustained by Cold War secrecy and incomplete archival records. The result was a disaster examined repeatedly through changing generations of technology and interpretation without ever producing a universally accepted conclusion. Far beneath the Atlantic, the remains of USS Scorpion still lie in darkness, where the pressure of the ocean has preserved the silence that followed its final transmission. The silent patrol of USS Thresher. Cold water moves steadily through the upper layers of the North Atlantic, a vast and indifferent expanse where naval operations often unfolded beneath the assumption that depth itself could be controlled through engineering precision and procedural discipline. In the spring of 1963, USS Thresher entered these waters as part of a carefully structured series of deep-diving tests designed not to explore unknown regions of the ocean, but to confirm the limits of a vessel already considered among the most advanced submarines in the United States fleet. Nothing about the outward conditions suggested deviation from routine operations, yet the exercise would soon become one of the most closely studied naval losses of the nuclear age, not because of what was immediately seen, but because of what was never fully recovered from beneath the surface. Engineers familiar with USS Thresher often regarded it as a milestone in submarine design, a Skipjack-class nuclear attack submarine intended to operate with greater stealth and greater depth capability than earlier generations of underwater vessels. Its streamlined hull and nuclear propulsion system reflected a period in which naval strategy was increasingly defined by endurance and invisibility rather than surface engagement, allowing submarines to remain submerged for extended periods while tracking potential adversaries across vast oceanic distances. Yet beneath this technological confidence existed subtle concerns about complexity, particularly in systems that depended on tightly integrated mechanical and electrical components functioning flawlessly under extreme pressure. Beneath scheduled operations and formal test protocols, the deep diving trial carried an implicit risk that was understood but not fully emphasized in public descriptions of the mission. USS Thresher was being lowered toward depths that approached the boundaries of its test envelope, accompanied by support vessels positioned above to maintain communication and monitor its progress. The Atlantic at those depths was not an environment that allowed gradual failure in the way surface conditions might. Pressure increased steadily with descent, and each additional foot of depth added force against the hull that no onboard crew could directly perceive until systems began to respond. Nearby on the surface, USS Skylark maintained its position as the primary communication link with the submarine, receiving intermittent transmissions that confirmed descent stages and system status reports. At first, the exchanges reflected standard operational language, structured and calm, indicating that USS Thresher remained within expected parameters as it continued downward. Yet even within these early communications, the rhythm of contact depended entirely on brief transmission windows, and any disruption in clarity would immediately place interpretation under strain, transmission patterns began to change as USS Skylark received messages that were less structured than those expected during controlled testing. The phrasing of reports suggested increasing difficulty within the submarine systems, though the exact nature of the problem was not immediately clear to those interpreting the signals on the surface. In later reconstructions of the event, these fragments would become critical, not because they provided direct explanations, but because they revealed the point at which normal communication protocols began to degrade under rapidly developing internal conditions. Minutes later, what should have remained routine confirmation exchanges collapsed into fragmented and partially obscured transmissions, forcing officers aboard USS Skylark to interpret incomplete statements while maintaining attempts to preserve contact with the descending submarine. The ambiguity of these messages created a growing uncertainty that could not be resolved in real time, especially as acoustic clarity deteriorated and the separation between vessels increased with depth. At the time, there was no immediate indication of total system failure, only the unsettling impression that multiple issues might be developing simultaneously below the surface. Far beneath the increasing weight of the Atlantic, USS Thresher entered a critical phase of descent, during which investigators later concluded that multiple systems may have begun failing in rapid succession. The submarine's internal environment, designed to remain stable under extreme external pressure, depended on a delicate balance of propulsion, ballast control, and emergency response mechanisms that required precise coordination. When any part of that balance shifted unexpectedly, recovery depended not only on mechanical function, but also on time, and time at those depths was measured in moments rather than minutes. Archive reconstruction efforts conducted through USS Skylark's deck logs and preserved communication transcripts later provided one of the most structured chronological records of the final descent sequence, revealing how rapidly coherent messages transitioned into fragmented technical references. Entries preserved in official documentation included brief statements indicating difficulty with maintaining depth control and attempts to regain positive buoyancy, though later analysis suggested these phrases represented conditions already in advanced stages of system failure. The importance of these records lay not in their completeness, but in their gradual breakdown, which allowed investigators to trace the progression of emergency response as it unfolded in real time. Emergency systems designed to stabilize buoyancy and counteract unintended descent were later examined extensively in the aftermath of the loss, particularly mechanisms responsible for controlling ballast and managing seawater flow within critical compartments. Investigators focused heavily on components that could have failed under pressure or responded incorrectly during rapid changes in depth. Recognizing that even minor malfunctions could cascade into uncontrollable descent once the submarine passed beyond certain operational thresholds, the technical review that followed the disaster would eventually contribute to one of the most significant safety overhauls in naval history. Deep-sea search operations conducted months later ultimately located the wreck of USS Thresher, resting at approximately 8,400 feet beneath the Atlantic surface, where the submarine had broken into multiple sections scattered across the seabed in a pattern consistent with violent structural failure under extreme pressure. Analysis of the debris field indicated that the hull did not fail gradually, but instead underwent a rapid collapse consistent with a sudden loss of integrity, an implosion event so forceful that recovery of intact structural sections was limited. The condition of the wreck reinforced the conclusion that once depth control was lost, the surrounding environment offered no margin for correction or recovery. Subsequent technical investigations, which later formed the foundation of the Navy's SubSafe program, identified vulnerabilities in certain piping systems joined through silver-brazed connections that were not fully adequate for extreme deep submergence conditions. These findings did not suggest a single point of failure, but rather a chain of vulnerabilities in which seawater intrusion could disable critical systems faster than corrective procedures could respond. The realization that such a failure could occur during a controlled test environment led to one of the most comprehensive redesign efforts in submarine safety procedures ever undertaken. For naval engineers and submarine crews throughout the Cold War period, the loss of USS Thresher became a defining moment that permanently altered assumptions about deep ocean operations and the reliability of even the most advanced nuclear submarines. Training procedures, inspection standards, and emergency protocols were all revised in response to the disaster, reflecting a recognition that technological advancement alone could not eliminate the risks posed by extreme underwater pressure. The event marked a shift in how safety was understood, moving from theoretical assurance to verified redundancy under conditions that left no room for error. Even decades after the incident, analysis continued to revisit the sequence of mechanical and procedural factors that may have contributed to the loss, yet no reconstruction has ever achieved absolute certainty regarding every moment of the final descent. The fragmented nature of the available data ensured that interpretations would always rely on inference as much as evidence, preserving a narrow space of ambiguity within an otherwise heavily documented disaster. Below the Atlantic surface, where pressure has long since sealed away every trace of motion, the descent of USS Thresher remains recorded only in fragments that never fully explain what changed in its final minutes. K-129 and the Cold War recovery operation. In the northern reaches of the Pacific Ocean during 1968, the Soviet ballistic missile submarine designated K-129 departed on a patrol route that would never be formally completed in any publicly acknowledged record. At the time, the vessel was part of the Soviet Pacific Fleet's strategic deterrent force, operating within a Cold War environment where ballistic missile submarines were designed to remain hidden beneath vast oceanic distances while maintaining the ability to deliver nuclear payloads if required. Unlike surface fleets that could be tracked through visual or radio contact, submarines such as K-129 existed in a space defined by limited external awareness, where their movements were inferred rather than continuously observed. At the time of its final voyage, K-129 carried this role into waters that were only partially covered by opposing surveillance systems, moving through a region of the Pacific where both American and Soviet intelligence operations attempted to map underwater activity through indirect acoustic monitoring. Its mission, like many submarine patrols of the era, was structured around silence, with communication deliberately minimized to reduce detection risk. Yet even within such carefully controlled operations, the expectation remained that periodic contact or position updates would eventually confirm the vessel's status. Without any confirmed distress transmission reaching Soviet command structures, the submarine's disappearance unfolded in near-total operational silence, leaving only fragments of timing assumptions and patrol schedules behind. Unlike surface incidents that often produce immediate visual confirmation or emergency signaling, submarine losses in deep ocean environments frequently leave no direct witness, and K-129 became an early example of how entire strategic assets could vanish without a single verified message indicating their final condition. When Soviet naval authorities began reconstructing the last known position of K-129, the absence of reliable communication data created immediate uncertainty regarding where or how the vessel had been lost. Analysts were forced to rely on routine reporting intervals and estimated navigation paths, attempting to reconstruct a probable track across an ocean that offered no visual markers once the submarine descended below the surface. The result was not a clear trajectory of events, but a narrowing field of possibilities shaped by incomplete operational records. Far across the Pacific monitoring network, American hydrophone systems later recorded an anomalous acoustic event that analysts would eventually examine as a possible indicator of catastrophic underwater failure. These systems, designed as part of a broader Cold War surveillance infrastructure, were capable of detecting low-frequency sounds produced by submarine activity, including mechanical noise, propulsion signatures, and sudden structural disruptions. At the time of recording, however, the event was not immediately identified as belonging to any specific vessel. During initial intelligence review of underwater sound data collected in March 1968, analysts noted a distinct acoustic signature that did not correspond to routine naval activity in the monitored Pacific zones. The recording contained a sharp and isolated sound event followed by a rapid absence of recognizable submarine movement patterns, prompting further examination within classified intelligence channels. While the data did not immediately confirm the identity of K-129, it became one of the earliest pieces of evidence later associated with the submarine's disappearance. What emerged from subsequent analysis was not a confirmed identification of K-129 at first, but rather a growing correlation between Soviet patrol records and an isolated deep ocean acoustic disturbance. As intelligence agencies compared timelines, patrol routes, and acoustic datasets, the likelihood that the recorded event corresponded to a Soviet submarine increased, although absolute confirmation remained beyond reach due to the limitations of underwater signal resolution and incomplete Soviet operational disclosure. As classified mapping efforts progressed, oceanographic calculations gradually narrowed the probable location of the wreckage to a remote section of the North Pacific, where depths exceeded standard recovery capability. These depths placed the suspected wreck far beyond conventional salvage operations of the period, effectively transforming the search from a recovery effort into a theoretical exercise in oceanic positioning rather than practical retrieval. Years later, the United States initiated a covert engineering operation designed specifically to retrieve material from extreme ocean depth without revealing the true purpose of the mission. This effort would become one of the most secretive maritime operations of the Cold War, structured under the guise of scientific exploration and deep-sea mining research, while concealing its actual intelligence objective. The existence of K-129 had by then already become a classified focus of strategic interest. Beneath the official explanation of deep-sea mining research, the vessel Hughes Glomar Explorer was constructed to support a recovery system unlike anything previously deployed at sea. Designed with specialized lifting mechanisms capable of operating at extreme depths, the ship represented a fusion of engineering ambition and intelligence secrecy, where technological innovation was driven not only by scientific possibility, but also by the necessity of concealment during Cold War operations. When recovery attempts eventually reached operational depth, the mechanical systems designed to lift portions of the submarine faced structural challenges that limited what could be physically retrieved from the ocean floor. The extreme pressure and fragility of the submerged wreck made complete recovery impossible, resulting in only partial extraction of material, while significant sections of K-129 remained undisturbed on the seabed. The precise extent of what was recovered was never fully disclosed in public detail. Across intelligence communities on both sides of the Cold War divide, competing interpretations of K-129's loss began to circulate, each attempting to reconcile incomplete data with strategic assumptions. The absence of a publicly verified cause allowed multiple theories to persist simultaneously, shaped as much by intelligence interpretation as by physical evidence recovered from the ocean floor. In Soviet assessments, early explanations leaned toward mechanical failure or navigational error, though internal discussions also acknowledged the possibility of external involvement without reaching a definitive conclusion. The lack of surviving crew testimony and the absence of immediate wreckage analysis limited the ability to confirm any single scenario, leaving official explanations necessarily restrained. On the American side, analysts continued to debate whether acoustic evidence pointed toward internal explosion events or possible collision scenarios involving unidentified submerged objects in contested waters. While no conclusive proof of collision was ever publicly established, the unusual timing of acoustic signatures and Soviet submarine patrol patterns fueled continued analytical scrutiny within classified intelligence circles. Even after partial recovery operations concluded, significant portions of K-129 remained on the ocean floor, preserving gaps in physical evidence that prevented full reconstruction of the final sequence of events. These missing sections ensured that any interpretation of the submarine's loss would remain dependent on inference rather than complete physical verification, a limitation that persisted despite technological advances in deep-sea exploration. Decades of intelligence declassification revealed only fragments of the broader operation, confirming that both recovery capability and analytical certainty had remained incomplete throughout the mission. Even as additional details emerged over time, the absence of full transparency ensured that the operational history of K-129 remained partially obscured, shaped by selective disclosure rather than comprehensive release. Far beyond the operational secrecy of the Cold War itself, K-129 ultimately became defined not by a single confirmed cause, but by the persistent divergence between two incomplete historical narratives. Somewhere between what was lifted from the Pacific floor and what was left behind, the story of K-129 continues to exist in two versions that never fully align. The last transmission of INS Dakar. In the early weeks of 1968, a British-built submarine designated HMS Totem, later transferred and renamed INS Dakar, departed from Portsmouth on a carefully documented voyage toward its final service destination in the Eastern Mediterranean. The transfer itself was part of a broader post-war naval practice, in which older but still capable submarines were reassigned between Allied fleets, and in this case the vessel was undergoing its final transit before becoming fully integrated into the Israeli Navy. At the time of departure, the journey appeared procedural and controlled, framed within established naval logistics rather than operational deployment, and nothing in the recorded conditions suggested that the passage itself would become historically significant for reasons far removed from its intended purpose. At the moment of its departure, INS Dakar carried with it the technical lineage of a wartime submarine that had already undergone extensive refitting, inspection and modernization to meet Cold War operational standards. Its hull, originally designed for the demands of the Second World War, had been adapted to remain functional in an era defined by quieter propulsion expectations and extended underwater endurance requirements. Naval records indicate that the vessel had successfully completed sea trials prior to its transfer, and its systems were considered fit for the controlled voyage ahead, reinforcing the expectation that its movement from Britain to the Mediterranean would proceed without incident. Across the Mediterranean transit route, scheduled communication checkpoints were established to confirm position and progress, forming a structured tracking framework that depended on periodic transmissions rather than continuous surveillance. These checkpoints were not unusual for naval transfers of the period, as submarines often maintained limited communication profiles to preserve operational security and reduce unnecessary transmission exposure. Within this framework, INS Dakar was expected to report at predetermined intervals, allowing naval authorities to maintain a coherent understanding of its progress through increasingly enclosed maritime regions. As the submarine advanced through its intended passage, recorded transmission points began to pass without confirmed updates, creating early but subtle uncertainty within monitoring stations responsible for its route oversight. At first, these gaps did not immediately suggest catastrophic failure, as communication interruptions could occur due to atmospheric interference, equipment limitations, or operational adjustments during transit. However, as additional scheduled contact points passed without verification, the absence began to form a pattern that required closer attention, even though no distress signal had been officially recorded. Far from immediate recognition of any emergency condition, the last fragmented signals attributed to INS Dakar were interpreted through incomplete reception data that offered no clear indication of structural or mechanical failure. These transmissions, as preserved in naval communication logs, did not contain explicit language of distress, but instead reflected partial confirmations and incomplete positional references that could not be fully resolved into a continuous narrative. The ambiguity of these fragments would later become central to long-term investigations, as analysts attempted to determine whether they represented normal transmission degradation or the earlier signs of a developing emergency below the surface. During the final phase of expected communication, naval records show increasing gaps between transmission opportunities, though no verified distress sequence was ever conclusively recorded. This absence of a definitive emergency signal created a critical limitation in later analysis, as investigators lacked the kind of final, structured transmission often used to reconstruct submarine loss events. Without such a signal, the timeline of INS Dakar's final hours remained dependent on indirect inference, rather than confirmed operational reporting. What followed across the Mediterranean region was not a single concentrated search effort, but a widening pattern of coordinated naval operations attempting to trace a vessel that had left no definitive positional marker. Multiple navies contributed to search activities due to the international nature of the Mediterranean transit route, and designated search zones were established based on last known contact points and estimated travel speed. Despite these coordinated efforts, no immediate physical confirmation of wreckage or debris was located within the expected search corridors, which deepened uncertainty regarding the submarine's final position. As search operations expanded across multiple maritime zones, the absence of wreckage or confirmed debris created a growing disparity between expected discovery timelines and actual results. The Mediterranean Sea, while significantly smaller than open ocean environments, contains complex underwater terrain with variable depth structures, currents, and geological formations that can obscure or disperse wreckage patterns. This environmental complexity contributed to prolonged uncertainty, as initial assumptions about rapid localization did not align with the lack of tangible findings. In the years that followed, the disappearance of INS Dakar gradually shifted from an active search operation into a prolonged, unresolved case, with periodic reassessments conducted as new technologies became available. These later efforts were not driven by immediate operational urgency, but by the desire to reconcile historical records with modern detection capabilities, reflecting how unresolved naval losses often remain open within institutional memory long after active search phases conclude. Many years after the disappearance, renewed deep water surveys in the eastern Mediterranean eventually located the wreck of INS Dakar resting at significant depth between Crete and Cyprus. The discovery confirmed the submarine's final resting position, providing physical closure regarding location, while simultaneously introducing new limitations in determining cause. The wreck's position at depth indicated that the submarine had descended into an environment where recovery operations at the time of disappearance would have been extremely difficult or impossible, reinforcing the constraints faced by early search efforts. Beneath the conditions recorded at the wreck site, structural analysis suggested a sudden and severe failure event, though the exact initiating cause remained unconfirmed within available technical assessments. The condition of the hull indicated that the submarine had experienced a rapid loss of integrity, but available evidence did not conclusively isolate whether this resulted from mechanical malfunction, environmental factors, or a chain of operational failures occurring in sequence. The absence of a single definitive trigger preserved multiple interpretive possibilities within technical review frameworks. In the decades that followed, public and private examinations of recovered data continued to revisit the final transmission records, searching for clarity within fragments that resisted full interpretation. Each review cycle brought incremental refinements in understanding communication timing and signal degradation, yet none succeeded in producing a fully coherent reconstruction of the final moments aboard INS Dakar. The persistence of these analytical efforts reflected the enduring difficulty of translating partial communication data into complete operational narratives. Across historical accounts and official naval records, INS Dakar gradually became defined less by its operational journey and more by the prolonged absence that followed its disappearance. Unlike losses that produced immediate wreck confirmation or clear mechanical causation, this case remained anchored in a transitional space between recorded movement and confirmed stillness, where the absence itself became the primary defining characteristic of the event. Even after physical confirmation of the wreck, interpretive gaps between recorded communication data and structural findings ensured that no single explanatory framework achieved universal acceptance. The presence of conflicting indicators within the available evidence prevented consolidation into a singular conclusion, leaving the event distributed across multiple analytical interpretations rather than resolved within one definitive account. Within national memory and naval history alike, the submarine's absence persisted long after its location was known, sustained by the unresolved nature of its final recorded signals. The distinction between discovery and understanding remained central to how INS Dakar was remembered, as physical identification did not equate to narrative completion. Extending far past the boundaries of technical inquiry, the human dimension of the loss reached across decades of unanswered expectation, as families and institutions continued to await clarity that never fully arrived. This prolonged period of uncertainty transformed the disappearance into a historical condition that extended beyond engineering analysis, embedding it within collective memory as an unresolved absence that resisted closure. What remained of INS Dakar was not a conclusion, but a transmission that history could no longer complete. Kursk, the disaster witnessed by the world. During large-scale Northern Fleet exercises conducted in the Barents Sea in August 2000, the Russian submarine Kursk was operating as part of a coordinated naval formation, engaged in simulated combat scenarios involving multiple surface ships and underwater units. The exercise represented one of the more complex training operations of the post-Soviet Russian Navy, involving live ordnance drills designed to replicate wartime conditions within a controlled environment. Kursk itself, a nuclear-powered Oscar II-class submarine, was one of the most advanced cruise missile submarines in the fleet, designed for long-range strike capability and heavily reinforced to operate in harsh Arctic conditions. On paper, the vessel was considered highly capable, its design reflecting decades of Soviet submarine engineering evolution, focused on survivability and offensive power. Across seismic monitoring networks in Northern Europe, 2 distinct underwater shock waves were recorded within a very short interval, registering immediately as anomalous energy releases consistent with large-scale underwater explosions. These signals were detected independently by monitoring stations in multiple countries, including Norway and other NATO-aligned observation systems, which routinely tracked seismic activity in the Arctic and northern maritime regions. The timing and intensity of the signals indicated that the events were not minor disturbances, but significant underwater detonations capable of being measured across long distances through the Earth's crust. At the exact moment these seismic disturbances occurred, naval instruments and monitoring systems across multiple countries began registering simultaneous acoustic irregularities that did not align with routine military exercise patterns. The dual nature of the recorded signals led analysts to conclude that at least 2 separate explosive events had taken place within a very short time frame, with the second event significantly larger in magnitude than the first. However, despite the clarity of the seismic record, no immediate visual or direct confirmation from surface vessels in the exercise area was available at the time of detection. Within minutes of the recorded explosions, communication channels with Kursk ceased entirely, leaving the submarine unresponsive during a phase of active fleet coordination in the exercise zone. Standard naval protocols expected periodic contact or confirmation signals during such operations, but no further transmissions were received following the seismic events. The sudden silence marked a critical transition from routine exercise conditions to an unconfirmed emergency state, though the full severity of the situation was not yet publicly acknowledged. Despite early detection of unusual underwater activity, initial assessments within Russian naval command structures treated the situation with measured caution rather than immediate classification as catastrophic failure. Early reports did not publicly confirm the extent of the incident, and official communication initially suggested uncertainty regarding the submarine's status rather than immediate loss. This cautious approach contributed to a delay in full-scale acknowledgement of the disaster, as internal assessments attempted to reconcile available data with operational expectations. Nearby vessels participating in the same exercise registered indirect indicators of disturbance, though environmental conditions and operational constraints prevented any immediate verification of the submarine's internal status. Other submarines and surface ships in the exercise area reported irregular acoustic readings, but visibility limitations, water conditions, and ongoing training maneuvers restricted the ability to conduct rapid localized assessment of Kursk's condition. As a result, the situation remained fragmented across multiple observation points without a unified operational picture. As time progressed beyond the initial explosion window, emerging evidence suggested that portions of the crew may have survived the initial catastrophic event within isolated compartments of the submarine. Later forensic analysis of the wreck indicated that certain sections of Kursk remained structurally intact, long enough to potentially sustain temporary survivable conditions. These conclusions were based on internal compartment integrity, air pocket analysis, and the arrangement of damage patterns observed during recovery operations. Inside the submarine's surviving sections, later analysis supported the possibility of a temporary survivable environment, shaped by trapped air pockets and limited functional systems following the initial structural damage. Investigators examining the wreck concluded that some compartments were sealed off in ways that could have allowed a brief survival window, though the duration and conditions inside those spaces remained uncertain. This possibility introduced a deeply human dimension to the disaster, transforming it from a purely technical failure into a scenario involving potential delayed loss of life under extreme conditions. Despite growing indications of a severe onboard emergency, external rescue operations faced significant delays due to environmental conditions, technical limitations, and procedural escalation requirements within naval command structures. The Barents Sea environment, combined with the depth and position of the submarine, created substantial challenges for rapid intervention. Specialized rescue assets required time to mobilize, and coordination between different units introduced further delays during the critical early phase of the incident. Simultaneously, international monitoring agencies that had recorded the initial seismic signatures began independently identifying the likelihood of a major submarine incident in the Barents Sea region. Independent analysis of seismic data quickly led external observers to conclude that a significant underwater event had occurred, even before official confirmation was released. This parallel awareness outside Russian command structures created a situation in which parts of the global scientific and intelligence community recognized the disaster before full public acknowledgement was made. Within global media cycles, reports of underwater explosions associated with Kursk began circulating before full official confirmation had been issued by Russian authorities. Early reporting relied heavily on seismic interpretations and anonymous sources, leading to widespread speculation about the scale and nature of the incident. The contrast between external analytical certainty and internal official caution contributed to heightened international attention during the initial days following the disaster. Across political and military communication channels, information regarding the condition of Kursk remained tightly controlled during the critical, early phase of the disaster response. Official statements initially avoided definitive language, focusing instead on ongoing efforts to assess the situation. This controlled flow of information became a defining feature of the early response period, shaping both domestic and international perceptions of the unfolding event. Months later, coordinated salvage operations recovered the wreck of Kursk from the Barents Sea floor, confirming the scale of structural destruction sustained during the initial underwater explosions. The recovery operation revealed extensive damage to the forward sections of the submarine, consistent with a high-energy internal event that rapidly compromised structural integrity. The physical evidence provided a clearer picture of the magnitude of destruction, though it did not fully resolve questions regarding the exact initiating cause. During post-recovery analysis, structural evidence indicated a complex sequence of internal failures that aligned with both explosive force and rapid flooding dynamics within multiple compartments. Investigators identified damage patterns consistent with a torpedo-related detonation scenario, though alternative interpretations involving external impact or secondary internal reactions remained part of ongoing analysis. The complexity of the damage prevented a single, universally accepted conclusion from forming within technical communities. Even after extensive technical investigation, multiple competing interpretations of the initiating event continued to persist within naval and forensic analysis communities. While certain findings pointed toward a probable internal explosion, other unresolved inconsistencies in the sequence of damage left room for continued debate. The absence of a fully linear reconstruction ensured that the disaster remained partially open to interpretation, despite physical recovery of the vessel. Long before the full scope of the Kursk disaster was formally assembled into a coherent investigative timeline, seismic readings and naval monitoring data from the Barents Sea had already registered the event as a distinct physical occurrence, captured independently by multiple observation systems operating under different jurisdictions and technical frameworks. The information did not arrive as a single unified report, but as overlapping streams of detection that were later aligned through analysis rather than immediate recognition. The record of Kursk exists not as a single account, but as a moment that was captured completely without ever being fully assembled. The unexplained loss of the French submarine Minerve. Naval departure records from Toulon indicate that the French submarine Minerve left port on 27 January 1968 as part of a scheduled training patrol assigned to the Western Mediterranean operating zone. The vessel, a Daphne-class submarine designed for coastal defence and anti-submarine warfare, was operating within a routine framework of post-war French naval exercises intended to maintain readiness and evaluate submerged navigation performance under controlled conditions. At the time of departure, nothing in the official documentation suggested deviation from standard procedure, and Minerve was expected to complete its training cycle before returning to base within a defined operational window. Operational documentation from the French Navy classified Minerve's mission as routine submerged exercises intended to evaluate navigation accuracy and communication consistency under standard patrol conditions. These exercises typically involved submerged maneuvers, periodic surfacing or periscope-level checks when required, and scheduled radio communication points designed to confirm positional awareness without compromising operational discipline. In this context, Minerve's assignment was not unusual, and its crew operated within established protocols familiar to submarine operations of the era. Meteorological charts covering the Western Mediterranean that day show a progressive deterioration in surface conditions, with wind intensity and sea state increasing along the submarine's projected transit corridor. While submarines operate primarily below the surface conditions can still influence submerged navigation through pressure changes, water movement, and communication interference. However, there is no confirmed indication that these environmental factors were considered exceptional enough at the time to alter or cancel the exercise schedule. Recorded transmissions from Minerve's final communication window contained only standard positional confirmations, consistent with normal procedure and showing no indication of mechanical distress or emergency escalation. These transmissions reflected routine operational language, primarily focused on confirming location and maintaining scheduled contact discipline. Nothing in the preserved communication logs suggests alarm, disruption, or deviation from expected protocol, which later contributed to the uncertainty surrounding the vessel's disappearance. Communication tracking logs later revealed that expected reporting intervals passed without additional contact, creating an expanding gap between anticipated and confirmed positional data during the submarine's transit phase. As each scheduled transmission point elapsed without confirmation, uncertainty began to accumulate within monitoring structures responsible for tracking submarine movement. However, at this stage, the absence of communication was still compatible with non-critical explanations such as transmission interference or operational delay. Initial naval response protocols treated the missing return of Minerve as a potential delay scenario, reflecting standard procedure for submarines operating with limited surface communication during training exercises. In naval operations of the period, delayed contact did not immediately indicate catastrophe, as communication disruptions were not uncommon in submerged environments. As a result, early assessments remained cautious, focusing on verification rather than emergency escalation. Search coordination across French naval units began by concentrating on the last verified position of Minerve, extending outward in calculated patterns across the western Mediterranean basin. These search patterns were designed to account for drift, navigation uncertainty, and possible deviations from the planned route. Aircraft, surface vessels, and sonar-equipped ships were deployed in structured grids, intended to maximize coverage within a defined probability zone. Despite systematic surface and underwater scanning efforts, early search operations produced no confirmed debris fields, acoustic markers, or identifiable wreckage linked to Minerve's structure. The absence of physical evidence complicated efforts to refine the search area, as no definitive indicators suggested whether the submarine had suffered mechanical failure, navigational error, or sudden catastrophic loss. The Mediterranean's complex underwater terrain further reduced the likelihood of immediate discovery using the technology available at the time. French naval archives later reclassified the disappearance as a long-term unresolved loss after repeated search cycles failed to establish any physical confirmation of the submarine's location. Over time, the case transitioned from an active operational emergency into a historical naval loss, preserved in official records but no longer subject to continuous search operations. This transition reflected procedural closure rather than explanatory resolution, as no definitive cause or location had been established. Advanced deep-sea survey work conducted more than 50 years later identified the wreck of Minerve resting at significant depth near the approaches to the Toulon maritime region. The discovery was made possible through modern sonar mapping technology capable of resolving fine seabed structures that had been beyond the reach of earlier search systems. The location of the wreck close to its departure region added a further layer of complexity to earlier assumptions about its final trajectory. Structural examination of the wreck site suggested a rapid descent sequence consistent with sudden loss of buoyancy or control, though no definitive initiating event could be isolated from the available evidence. The submarine's condition indicated a violent and abrupt transition from operational state to catastrophic failure, but the absence of surviving operational records from the final moments limited precise reconstruction of the sequence of events leading to its descent. Technical analysis of recovered data and hull deformation patterns did not converge into a single uninterrupted reconstruction of the submarine's final operational moments. Different interpretations of the structural damage suggested multiple possible failure pathways, but none achieved universal confirmation within technical review frameworks. As a result, the final phase of Minerve's operation remained partially reconstructed but not fully resolved. Within official naval historical records, Minerve's case is preserved as an incident defined by the absence of a detectable transition from normal operation into declared emergency conditions. Unlike incidents where distress signals or partial emergency communications provide a temporal breakdown of events, Minerve's loss is characterized by the lack of any confirmed escalation sequence, leaving only routine contact followed by complete absence. Across decades of retrospective study, the defining anomaly remained the complete disappearance of all transitional signals between routine navigation and permanent loss of contact. This absence of intermediate evidence prevented analysts from constructing a detailed timeline of failure, reinforcing the sense that the submarine moved from normalcy into silence without a documented bridge between the two states. As modern interpretation of the case continues to evolve, Minerve remains a reference point for discussions on the limitations of underwater detection and the constraints of mid-20th century submarine communication systems. Each new technological reassessment refines understanding of possible conditions at the time, yet none fully eliminate the uncertainty surrounding the exact mechanism of loss. The last confirmed trace of Minerve was not an emergency, but a routine signal that never received a reply from the sea it had already entered. The Argentine submarine ARA San Juan and the final signals. South Atlantic transit operations placed the Argentine submarine ARA San Juan on a return route toward Mar del Plata during the final phase of a patrol that initially appeared consistent with standard naval movement procedures. The submarine, a German-built TR-1700 class diesel-electric vessel commissioned into the Argentine Navy during the 1980s, had spent years operating as part of Argentina's shrinking but symbolically important submarine fleet. By November 2017, ARA San Juan was returning from patrol assignments near the southern reaches of the Atlantic, moving northward through increasingly difficult maritime conditions while maintaining scheduled communication procedures with naval command structures on shore. Messages later transmitted from aboard ARA San Juan indicated that seawater had entered through the submarine's snorkel system, contributing to an electrical disturbance affecting sections of the forward battery compartments. In diesel-electric submarines, battery systems are essential for submerged propulsion and internal electrical continuity, meaning even limited water intrusion can create dangerous short-circuit conditions capable of generating smoke, fire, or toxic gases within confined interior spaces. The communication sent from the submarine described the issue as serious enough to require isolation of affected battery sections, yet the wording of the report suggested that the crew still retained operational control over the vessel. Rather than signalling immediate catastrophic failure, the communication describing the electrical problem suggested that the crew had isolated the affected battery system and intended to continue navigating under revised operational conditions. According to later reconstructions of the final exchanges, the submarine reportedly planned to proceed submerged toward Mar del Plata, while operating on alternate electrical configurations after disconnecting damaged battery components. At that stage, the situation was framed operationally as a manageable onboard malfunction, rather than a terminal emergency, reinforcing the expectation that ARA San Juan would continue its transit, despite the complications already developing inside the vessel. Expectation within Argentine naval command structures therefore remained focused on continued contact and eventual arrival, since the final known communications did not explicitly indicate loss of control or imminent danger. Submarine operations often involve communication gaps due to submerged travel limitations, atmospheric interference, and operational discipline, meaning silence alone did not immediately confirm disaster. However, as hours passed beyond anticipated reporting intervals, the absence of further communication gradually shifted interpretation away from routine delay and toward growing concern regarding the submarine's actual condition. Intervals between scheduled transmissions gradually expanded beyond anticipated operational margins, transforming what had initially been interpreted as manageable communication delay into growing uncertainty regarding the submarine's status. Naval command personnel responsible for tracking ARA San Juan were eventually forced to consider the possibility that the submarine had experienced a major disabling event somewhere within the vast expanse of the South Atlantic. The operational challenge became immediately apparent because the submarine's precise location during its final movements could only be approximated through its last known communication data and estimated navigational trajectory. Search aircraft, naval vessels, and international maritime support teams soon began scanning widening sectors of the South Atlantic as concerns surrounding the disappearance of ARA San Juan intensified. Argentina's naval response quickly expanded into a multinational search effort involving resources from numerous countries, including aircraft equipped with magnetic anomaly detection systems, sonar-capable vessels, and deep-sea search technologies designed for submarine recovery operations. The scale of the response reflected both the seriousness of the disappearance and the recognition that time would become increasingly critical if any section of the crew had survived an onboard emergency. Ocean conditions in the search region complicated detection efforts considerably, with strong currents, variable depths, and unstable weather systems reducing the reliability of surface and underwater monitoring operations. The South Atlantic presented an especially difficult environment for submarine search operations because of its immense scale and complex underwater geography, where trenches, uneven seabed structures, and shifting water layers interfered with acoustic interpretation and sonar mapping. Even advanced search systems struggled to distinguish meaningful anomalies from natural underwater conditions across such an enormous operational area. Reports involving possible sonar contacts, acoustic detections, and unidentified underwater sounds began circulating, while rescue calculations were still being actively discussed within naval coordination centres. Some reports described noises that observers believed could potentially originate from survivors attempting to signal rescuers from within a disabled submarine hull, while other interpretations suggested underwater environmental interference or unrelated acoustic phenomena. The existence of these reports intensified emotional uncertainty surrounding the disappearance because they sustained the possibility that crew members aboard Ara San Juan might still be alive beneath the ocean surface. Public attention increasingly focused on the possibility that surviving crew members aboard Ara San Juan might still be awaiting rescue beneath the South Atlantic, particularly as oxygen supply estimates continued to be debated across media coverage and official briefings. News broadcasts and naval analysts discussed theoretical survival windows based on submarine compartment integrity, available oxygen reserves, and emergency power capabilities. Families gathered near naval facilities and communication centres followed every reported development closely, often receiving incomplete or changing information, while search operations continued across the ocean. Hydroacoustic monitoring data later examined by international analysts identified a powerful underwater event occurring near the estimated disappearance zone, consistent with a sudden implosive sequence at significant depth. This acoustic signal was detected by instruments associated with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, which maintains hydroacoustic monitoring systems capable of identifying underwater explosive or implosive events across long distances. The timing of the detected event corresponded closely with the period during which communication with Ara San Juan ceased, leading investigators to examine the possibility that the submarine had suffered catastrophic structural collapse. Although the acoustic evidence eventually altered investigative understanding of the submarine's likely fate, uncertainty persisted for a period of time because the detected event had not initially been interpreted with definitive operational certainty. In the early phase of the crisis, the hydroacoustic data existed alongside continuing rescue assumptions, rather than replacing them outright, allowing hope for survival to continue despite mounting evidence suggesting catastrophic loss. This overlap between technical interpretation and emotional expectation created one of the defining psychological tensions of the entire disaster. Families gathered near naval facilities and briefing centres were therefore forced to navigate a constantly shifting stream of partial updates, contradictory reports, and unconfirmed indications that repeatedly changed the perceived likelihood of survival. Statements from officials evolved over time as new information emerged, while rumours and speculative reporting spread rapidly through television broadcasts and social media platforms. For relatives awaiting definitive confirmation, the experience became defined not only by fear of loss, but by the instability of the information itself, where every update seemed capable of reversing previous assumptions. Deep-water search operations continued for months after the disappearance, relying on increasingly sophisticated seabed mapping systems capable of examining vast sections of the South Atlantic floor in high detail. Specialized underwater vehicles and sonar technologies were eventually deployed to analyze deep ocean terrain where conventional search methods had previously failed to identify meaningful targets. The persistence of the search reflected both the technical difficulty of locating the submarine and the symbolic importance of recovering definitive evidence regarding its fate. Survey efforts conducted by the exploration company Ocean Infinity eventually located the wreck of Ara San Juan in 2018 at substantial depth, confirming that the submarine had suffered catastrophic structural destruction. Images and analysis from the wreck site revealed evidence consistent with extreme implosion forces generated by overwhelming external water pressure at great depth. The submarine's fragmented condition reinforced interpretations suggesting that the hull had collapsed rapidly during descent, leaving little possibility of survival following the final catastrophic event. Analysis of the wreck site strengthened interpretations involving rapid implosion under extreme pressure conditions. though investigators continued examining the precise relationship between the earlier electrical malfunction and the submarine's final descent sequence. Questions remained regarding how the reported battery failure may have interacted with submerged operational procedures, internal systems management, and emergency response decisions during the submarine's final hours. Although the physical discovery clarified the submarine's fate, it did not completely eliminate uncertainty regarding the exact chain of events that led to irreversible loss. Retrospective examination of the final communications gradually transformed ordinary operational messages into critical historical evidence, with phrases once interpreted as manageable technical reporting later viewed through the context of catastrophic failure. Investigators and analysts revisited the submarine's final transmissions repeatedly, attempting to determine whether subtle indicators of escalating danger had existed within communications originally perceived as controlled and procedural. The same words that initially sustained confidence in the submarine's survivability eventually became part of a reconstructed timeline pointing toward disaster already in progress. Long after the physical fate of ARA San Juan had been confirmed, the emotional structure of the disaster remained tied to the period in which hope continued despite the growing evidence that rescue was no longer possible. The disappearance became remembered not only as a submarine loss, but as an event shaped by the prolonged interval between technical detection and emotional acceptance, where uncertainty itself became part of the tragedy experienced by families, naval personnel, and the public following the search. For days after ARA San Juan had already disappeared beneath the South Atlantic, the possibility of hearing from the crew still remained alive above the surface. Soviet echoes beneath the Arctic, the mystery of K-8. Cold War patrol routes carried the Soviet nuclear submarine K-8 through the North Atlantic, during a period when underwater military operations increasingly extended into remote and environmentally hostile regions of the ocean. Built as part of the November-class and Project 627A program, K-8 represented early Soviet nuclear submarine capability, operating at a time when reactor propulsion at sea was still relatively new, technically ambitious, and not yet fully stabilized in long-duration operational environments. Its mission profile placed it within contested Cold War waters, where NATO and Soviet naval forces routinely monitored one another's movements through submerged tracking systems and distant acoustic detection networks, creating a strategic environment defined by silence, distance, and constant uncertainty beneath the surface. Flames were reported inside K-8 while the submarine was operating submerged in the North Atlantic in April 1970, following a sequence of onboard technical failures that escalated into a major internal fire event. The origin of the fire was later associated with electrical system malfunctions that spread into compartments containing critical control equipment, forcing immediate damage control procedures in an environment where fire suppression options were extremely limited due to confined air circulation and nuclear-powered operational constraints. In the enclosed structure of a submarine, fire does not remain localized for long, and within K-8 the situation rapidly evolved beyond isolated failure into a multi-compartment emergency affecting survivability conditions across the vessel. Dense smoke soon moved through interior sections of the vessel, reducing visibility and creating dangerous atmospheric conditions that complicated movement, communication, and emergency response efforts aboard K-8. Crew members were forced to navigate narrow passageways filled with toxic fumes, relying on emergency breathing apparatus and compartment isolation protocols designed for scenarios where standard life support systems become compromised. The spread of smoke transformed the submarine's interior into a disorienting environment where even basic coordination between compartments became increasingly difficult to maintain, particularly as electrical instability reduced system reliability across multiple operational zones. Emergency procedures initiated by the crew eventually brought the submarine to the surface, though surfacing did not eliminate the mechanical instability and environmental danger already developing throughout the vessel. At the surface, K-8 remained structurally compromised, with damage sustained during the internal fire continuing to affect onboard systems, while external conditions in the North Atlantic added further strain to already weakened operational integrity. Surfacing provided access to air and external coordination, but it did not resolve the underlying system failures that had triggered the emergency in the first place, leaving the submarine in a vulnerable transitional state between submerged crisis and surface instability. Towering waves and deteriorating weather conditions across the North Atlantic placed additional strain on Soviet attempts to stabilize the damaged submarine after the initial onboard fires had been partially contained. The sea state during this period was reported as severe, with strong winds and high wave activity creating unstable surface conditions that complicated both onboard control and external assistance efforts. In such conditions, even a surface submarine does not remain stable, and K-8 was subject to constant movement that interfered with containment efforts, mechanical assessments, and coordination between crew sections attempting to manage the evolving situation. Transfer operations between K-8 and nearby Soviet support vessels unfolded under increasingly hazardous sea conditions, as commanders attempted to evacuate portions of the crew without abandoning the submarine entirely. Evacuation in open ocean conditions requires precise timing and stable transfer points, both of which were significantly compromised by wave activity and the damaged condition of K-8 itself. Reports indicate that portions of the crew were removed from the submarine while others remained on board to assist with ongoing stabilization efforts, creating a divided operational structure in which responsibility for the vessel remained partially active even during evacuation procedures. Radiation concerns surrounding the disabled nuclear submarine added another layer of uncertainty to the crisis, particularly as Soviet naval authorities assessed the condition of the onboard reactor systems after the fires. Although no immediate reactor breach was officially confirmed, the presence of nuclear propulsion introduced inherent risk considerations that extended beyond conventional submarine damage scenarios. The possibility of reactor instability, combined with fire damage and flooding risk, meant that operational decisions were being made under conditions where the full extent of internal system integrity could not be immediately verified. Official Soviet reporting released after the disaster presented an incomplete picture of the sequence aboard K-8, with casualty figures, operational details, and timelines varying across different accounts. As with many Cold War-era incidents involving strategic military assets, information control and delayed disclosure contributed to inconsistencies in public understanding of the event. Over time, reconstructed accounts varied in detail, particularly regarding the exact number of crew members lost during the sinking phase, and the precise sequence of events leading from surface instability to final submergence. Mechanical instability aboard the submarine continued worsening during towing attempts, leaving K-8 vulnerable to flooding and structural failure, while storms persisted across the surrounding Atlantic waters. After initial containment and partial evacuation, efforts were made to secure the submarine for towing, but damage sustained during the fire and exposure to extreme sea conditions weakened its ability to maintain buoyancy and structural integrity. Water ingress combined with compromised internal compartments gradually reduced the vessel's stability, making controlled towing increasingly difficult as the operation progressed. Eventually, the damaged submarine descended beneath the surface during the ongoing recovery effort, carrying crew members and nuclear systems into deep Atlantic waters far from immediate recovery capability. The sinking did not occur as a sudden singular moment of failure, but rather as the final outcome of a prolonged sequence of structural degradation, environmental pressure, and incomplete stabilization efforts. Once submerged beyond recovery depth, K-8 transitioned from a crisis still actively being managed into a permanent loss within the Atlantic environment, where retrieval was not feasible under the operational conditions of the time. Later examination of the disaster raised continuing concerns regarding the long-term condition of the wreck and the environmental risks associated with a nuclear submarine resting on the ocean floor. The presence of nuclear materials aboard K-8 introduced enduring questions about containment integrity and long-term ecological impact, particularly given the limited recovery capabilities available during the era in which the sinking occurred. Although immediate contamination was not publicly confirmed at the time, the theoretical risk remained part of later analytical discussions regarding the submarine's resting condition. Historical reconstruction of the K-8 incident remained complicated by fragmented Soviet-era documentation, restricted military disclosure practices, and inconsistencies between official summaries and survivor testimony. The combination of limited access to operational records and varying post-event accounts meant that later analyses had to rely on partial information, often reconstructed from secondary sources or retrospective technical evaluations. As a result, the full sequence of internal decision-making aboard K-8 during the fire and evacuation phase remains only partially reconstructed. Unlike submarine disasters defined by sudden disappearance alone, the loss of K8 unfolded through a visible sequence of deterioration in which fire, exhaustion, weather, and mechanical instability combined over time into irreversible collapse. This progression distinguished K8 from cases where submarines vanished without observable intermediate phases, instead presenting a scenario in which the failure was distributed across multiple stages that each contributed to the final outcome. The event therefore occupies a distinct position within Cold War naval history, characterized not by instant loss, but by extended operational breakdown under compounding conditions. Across subsequent decades of naval analysis, K8 continued to stand apart as a case where survival efforts, evacuation attempts, and worsening environmental conditions remained intertwined long before the submarine finally vanished beneath the Atlantic. The presence of multiple overlapping failure domains, mechanical, environmental, and procedural, meant that no single factor can fully account for the outcome in isolation, reinforcing the complexity of reconstructing the final sequence with complete certainty. K8 became a case where fire, weather, and failure merged into a single loss that no reconstruction could fully separate: the nuclear fire inside K2-19. Irregular pressure readings inside K2-19's missile compartment systems marked the earliest identifiable deviation from normal operational stability before any external condition was reported. Within the sealed structure of a Soviet Project 667A Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine, sensor data was continuously monitored across propulsion, ballast, and weapons compartments, and even minor deviations in pressure behavior could indicate developing structural stress. At first, these anomalies did not suggest catastrophic failure, but rather a technical inconsistency that required attention within standard operational protocols, the kind of irregularity that submarines are routinely designed to compensate for during extended submerged patrols. Warning indicators tied to ballast and compartment integrity began escalating internally as sensor data reflected instability within the submarine's sealed missile tube structures. These systems were designed to remain isolated from seawater under all normal conditions, and any disruption in their pressure balance suggested that a barrier between external ocean force and internal missile housing had begun to weaken. As readings continued to fluctuate, the submarine's internal monitoring systems registered a pattern that no longer resembled isolated malfunction, but a progressive structural compromise developing within a critical section of the vessel. A sudden rupture in one of the ballistic missile compartments triggered immediate flooding that bypassed initial containment thresholds and initiated a cascading internal emergency. The failure occurred within a system that was never intended to be exposed to direct seawater pressure, and once the structural integrity of the missile tube was compromised, water intrusion spread rapidly into adjacent sections. In submarine design of this era, compartmentalization is intended to limit damage propagation, but in K2-19 the initial breach occurred in a zone whose failure carried disproportionate consequences for surrounding systems. Emergency damage control teams were deployed inside the submarine to isolate affected compartments and prevent structural failure from spreading into adjacent missile sections. These teams operated in confined environments where water ingress, pressure imbalance, and mechanical distortion created rapidly shifting conditions that demanded immediate and coordinated response. Internal sealing procedures were initiated in an attempt to slow the flooding, but the speed of water intrusion significantly reduced the effectiveness of standard containment measures designed for more gradual system failures. Electrical distribution systems began failing in sequence as water intrusion compromised interconnected control networks across multiple internal operational zones. Power systems in submarines are deeply interlinked, meaning that failure in one compartment can propagate through control lines affecting navigation, propulsion, and life support systems simultaneously. As electrical stability declined, instrumentation reliability also deteriorated, limiting the crew's ability to accurately assess the full extent of the damage unfolding within the missile compartment area. Attempts to stabilize the vessel required transitioning K2-19 into a surface-capable emergency configuration, despite ongoing internal flooding conditions. Bringing a ballistic missile submarine to the surface under emergency conditions introduces a new set of risks, particularly when internal compartments remain compromised and buoyancy is unevenly distributed across the hull. In K2-19's case, the decision to surface was not a resolution of the crisis, but a necessary shift in operating environment that allowed external conditions to be assessed, while internal damage continued to evolve. Rising Atlantic turbulence near the Bermuda region intensified hull stress as external environmental forces compounded the internal mechanical failure already underway. The North Atlantic in this operational sector is characterized by variable wave systems and deep water instability that can amplify structural strain on vessels already operating under compromised integrity. Once at or near the surface, K219 became exposed to conditions that interacted unpredictably with its damaged internal configuration, further complicating stabilization efforts. Internal response teams continued operating within compromised compartments, where flooding, smoke risk, and system instability limited mobility and control. Movement through the submarine required navigating narrow passageways affected by water intrusion and electrical failure, where visibility and environmental safety could not be guaranteed. Despite these conditions, damage control efforts persisted as crew members attempted to maintain enough structural integrity to prevent complete loss of the vessel during the early stages of the emergency. Interpretations of the initiating event later diverged sharply, with analysts debating whether the missile explosion originated from mechanical malfunction or external impact forces. Soviet-era accounts and later Western analyses presented competing frameworks for understanding how a ballistic missile submarine could experience such a catastrophic internal failure while operating in open ocean conditions. One interpretation suggested internal technical failure within missile systems, while another proposed the possibility of a collision event involving a foreign submarine, though no universally accepted evidence has resolved this disagreement. Evacuation procedures were gradually initiated as portions of the crew were removed from sections of the submarine no longer considered structurally secure. Transfer of personnel in open ocean conditions required coordination between distressed onboard systems and external support vessels operating in unstable sea states. Not all crew members were able to leave the submarine during early evacuation phases, as certain operational teams remained aboard to support damage control efforts and manage critical systems still under partial functionality. Progressive compartment collapse ultimately rendered sustained surface control impossible, forcing abandonment of remaining operational sections aboard K219. As flooding expanded and structural stability declined, the submarine could no longer maintain controlled buoyancy or operational integrity. The transition from emergency management to irreversible failure occurred gradually, shaped by the cumulative effect of internal explosion damage, system degradation, and environmental stress acting simultaneously across the vessel. The submarine descended beneath the Atlantic after extended structural degradation, following the initial missile compartment failure sequence. This final descent was not the result of a single moment of collapse, but the culmination of progressive instability that had begun with the initial rupture inside the missile section. Once submerged beyond recovery depth, K219 transitioned from a damaged but partially managed vessel into a permanent loss within the Atlantic environment. Post-incident reconstruction efforts failed to produce a universally accepted chain of events explaining the precise trigger of the internal explosion. Technical investigations conducted after the event were limited by incomplete physical access to the full structural damage and by conflicting interpretations of available data. As a result, the sequence of initiating failures remains partially reconstructed, with no single explanatory model achieving full consensus among analysts. Cold War-era documentation preserves K219 as an incident defined by conflicting interpretations, rather than a single confirmed initiating cause. The political and military context of the period contributed to variations in reporting, where strategic considerations influenced how details were recorded, released, or interpreted across different sources. This layered uncertainty continues to shape modern understanding of the event, particularly regarding whether the explosion originated from internal malfunction or external interaction. Within naval analysis, K219 is classified as a nuclear missile submarine loss, where system failure and external theory remain unresolved in parallel narratives. Unlike disasters defined by a single confirmed trigger, K219 occupies a category of incidents where multiple plausible explanations coexist without definitive resolution. This duality ensures that the event remains structurally ambiguous even within technical historical frameworks. K219 remains a disaster where the exact moment of failure is known, but its origin continues to resist a single explanation: USS Greyback and the decades-long search. Pacific Combat Patrol assignments placed USS Greyback among American submarines operating near Japanese-controlled shipping corridors during the final phase of the Second World War. By early 1944, submarine warfare in the Pacific had become increasingly aggressive and strategically essential, with American submarines targeting supply convoys, cargo vessels, and military transport routes that connected Japanese positions across occupied territories. Operating beneath vast stretches of ocean, where direct support was limited and communication windows were infrequent, submarines like USS Greyback carried out missions that depended heavily on isolation, stealth, and precise navigation through heavily defended waters. Conditions inside these submarines were physically exhausting even during routine operations, with crews enduring confined passageways, persistent engine vibration, stale recycled air, and long stretches without visual contact with the outside world, while navigating waters patrolled by aircraft, destroyers, and coastal defences capable of turning a single mistake into immediate destruction. Routine wartime transmissions from USS Greyback initially gave no indication that the submarine's final patrol would become one of the Pacific theatre's longest unresolved disappearances. The vessel departed from Pearl Harbor in January 1944 for its 10th combat patrol under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Anderson Moore, entering operational zones near the East China Sea and waters surrounding Okinawa. During the patrol, USS Greyback successfully attacked Japanese shipping targets, continuing the aggressive interdiction campaigns that American submarines were increasingly conducting against Japanese maritime logistics during the later years of the war. American submarine operations during this phase of the Pacific campaign had already begun severely disrupting Japanese transport capacity, forcing merchant vessels and military convoys into increasingly dangerous routes where submarines waited beneath heavily travelled maritime corridors. For submariners aboard USS Greyback, these patrols involved extended periods of submerged silence interrupted by brief moments of intense action whenever enemy ships entered torpedo range. Operational expectations surrounding USS Greyback remained largely normal even as the submarine moved deeper into contested waters near Okinawa during the closing stage of its patrol cycle. Naval command structures tracking submarine deployments were accustomed to irregular communication intervals because wartime patrol conditions often prevented vessels from transmitting freely without risking detection. Submarines frequently operated independently for long periods, while relying on scheduled reporting windows that could be delayed by weather, combat conditions, or tactical concealment requirements. Because of this operational reality, the absence of immediate alarm following USS Greyback's final transmissions did not initially suggest catastrophe, but rather another submarine continuing its mission beneath hostile waters, where silence itself was considered part of survival. Japanese military reporting compiled during late-war defensive operations later described an attack against an unidentified submarine near Okinawa under circumstances recorded amid escalating regional conflict. Wartime records from Japanese aircraft units documented an aerial engagement on February 26, 1944, in which bombs were reportedly dropped against a surface submarine operating in the area. According to those reports, the submarine was observed leaving an oil slick after the attack, though at the time the Japanese forces involved could not definitively identify the vessel. These fragmented accounts would later become central to attempts at reconstructing what happened to USS Greyback during its final days. Yet wartime reporting systems were often shaped by confusion, urgency, and incomplete observation, particularly during aerial attacks conducted over open water, where visibility, distance, and combat stress could easily distort identification accuracy. Military pilots conducting anti-submarine patrols during the Pacific campaign frequently relied on rapid visual recognition under unstable conditions that left little opportunity for detailed confirmation. Aircraft crews searching for submarines often had only seconds to identify targets before initiating attack runs, and the distinction between confirmed destruction, probable damage, or uncertain contact was not always clear within the report submitted afterward. Oil slicks, floating debris, or temporary loss of visual contact were frequently interpreted as signs of successful attack, even though submarines were sometimes capable of escaping after sustaining damage. In the case of USS Greyback, the Japanese report would eventually become treated as one of the most important surviving clues, despite originating from a wartime environment where precise documentation was extraordinarily difficult to maintain. Post-war naval investigators attempting to reconstruct the fate of USS Greyback relied heavily on translated Japanese documents, whose coordinate references appeared internally consistent at the time. After the war ended, American analysts examined captured Japanese military records in an effort to identify the likely locations of missing submarines that had failed to return from Pacific patrols. Among these records were reports associated with the February 1944 aerial attack, including location coordinates that appeared to match the presumed operational region of USS Greyback. Based on those translations, investigators concluded that the submarine had likely been destroyed in a specific search area southwest of Okinawa. Because the wartime attack report aligned generally with known patrol routes and operational timing, the translated coordinates gradually became accepted within official reconstruction efforts as the most reliable available reference point for the submarine's disappearance. A numerical conversion mistake embedded within those translated wartime records quietly shifted the presumed sinking location many miles away from where the submarine had actually been lost. The error involved the interpretation of Japanese map grid coordinates during translation into Western navigational references, creating a geographic displacement that significantly altered the search zone used by later expeditions. Although the mistake was small in appearance, its effect was enormous in practice, because underwater search operations rely on precise positioning within vast ocean environments where even minor coordinate inaccuracies can redirect exploration efforts far from an actual wreck site. The translation issue was not dramatic enough to immediately attract suspicion, which made it particularly dangerous from a historical perspective. Once entered into official documentation, the incorrect coordinates began functioning as accepted fact, repeated across naval references, research material, and later search planning without recognition that the original geographic interpretation itself had been compromised. Differences between wartime Japanese navigational notation and later translated coordinate systems contributed to a situation in which a single mistaken conversion quietly altered decades of investigative direction. Japanese military documentation during the war often used grid references and positional shorthand that required careful interpretation when converted into Western coordinate frameworks, particularly when later analysts worked from incomplete wartime material under post-war reconstruction pressures. In practice, the error surrounding USS Greyback was deceptively simple, involving the mistranslation of a directional value that displaced the presumed sinking area significantly from the submarine's true resting place. What made the situation especially unsettling was that the broader historical narrative surrounding the submarine appeared coherent despite being geographically incorrect at its core. Decades of underwater search activity continued focusing on incorrect sections of the Pacific because the original translation error remained undiscovered inside official historical documentation. Search teams working to locate USS Greyback repeatedly examined areas derived from the post-war coordinate interpretations, often using sonar and remotely operated systems to survey deep ocean terrain that ultimately contained no trace of the submarine. Over time, the accepted location became increasingly treated as established historical fact, despite the absence of physical confirmation from the seafloor itself. Each unsuccessful search reinforced the mystery surrounding the submarine, while simultaneously strengthening confidence in the assumption that investigators were already looking in the correct general area. Repeated search failures gradually transformed USS Greyback into one of the Pacific Theater's lingering submarine mysteries, where absence of evidence became accepted as a consequence of ocean depth rather than flawed interpretation. Deep-sea search operations are extremely expensive and technically demanding, often covering enormous underwater landscapes where wreckage can remain hidden beneath sediment, rock formations, or uneven terrain even when coordinates are approximately correct. Because of these difficulties, the inability to locate USS Greyback did not immediately undermine confidence in the translated records themselves. Instead, the ocean appeared to be withholding the submarine, when in reality investigators had been directed away from it by a mistake buried inside the very documents guiding the search. Families connected to USS Greyback spent generations without a confirmed wreck location, while the submarine itself rested outside the boundaries of the accepted search area. For relatives of the 80 crew members aboard, the disappearance remained one of the unresolved losses of the Pacific submarine campaign, where many vessels vanished without survivors or confirmed wreckage. Although the submarine had officially been declared lost during the war, the absence of physical discovery left the event suspended between documented history and incomplete understanding, preserved mostly through military records and memorial lists rather than direct evidence from the ocean floor. Unlike disasters witnessed directly or reconstructed through surviving testimony, USS Greyback existed largely through fragments of paperwork, patrol records, and assumptions that no one realized were geographically flawed. Archival researchers revisiting wartime Japanese source material eventually identified inconsistencies between the original coordinates and the translated versions long used by investigators. Historian Yutaka Iwasaki later re-examined the wartime records and recognized that the translated coordinates did not accurately reflect the original Japanese notation. By comparing the surviving source documents against the translated reports relied upon after the war, he discovered that the accepted search area had been displaced significantly due to the earlier conversion error. What had remained invisible for decades was suddenly revealed not through new physical evidence, but through careful re-examination of language, notation, and geographic interpretation. Fresh examination of the surviving records revealed that a single, mistranslated digit had altered the geographic interpretation of the submarine's final known position. The realization was unsettling not only because of its simplicity, but because it suggested that USS Greyback had potentially remained undiscovered for decades, while investigators searched the wrong section of ocean entirely. The submarine had not necessarily been hidden by depth alone, but by a mistaken interpretation embedded within the records designed to explain its disappearance. In practical terms, generations of search assumptions collapsed almost instantly once the corrected coordinates were understood, forcing a re-evaluation of everything believed about the submarine's final location. Modern deep-sea exploration teams subsequently redirected search operations toward waters near Okinawa that earlier expeditions had largely overlooked because of the long-standing coordinate discrepancy. The Lost 52 project, led by explorer Tim Taylor, began examining the corrected location using advanced sonar systems and remotely operated underwater vehicles capable of surveying deep water terrain with far greater precision than earlier generations of technology. Unlike post-war search efforts constrained by limited sonar mapping capability, these modern expeditions combined archival research with high-resolution underwater imaging techniques capable of identifying wreck structures resting thousands of feet below the surface. The search itself represented a convergence of historical correction and technological advancement, where modern equipment was finally being applied to coordinates no longer distorted by translation error. Discovery footage of USS Greyback ultimately confirmed that the submarine had remained far from the position accepted within official reconstruction efforts for decades. In 2019, search teams located the wreck resting more than 1,400 feet beneath the Pacific Ocean near Okinawa, with imagery revealing structural damage consistent with wartime attack reports. The submarine's hull, partially broken and resting along the seafloor, provided long-awaited physical confirmation of the vessel's final resting place after more than 75 years of uncertainty. For the first time since 1944, USS Greyback existed not merely as a missing wartime patrol listed in naval records, but as a visible structure resting in the darkness beneath the Pacific. Analysis of the wreck site aligned closely with Japanese wartime accounts, describing aerial attack damage sustained by a submarine operating in the area during February 1944. Structural evidence observed on the wreck appeared consistent with bomb-related damage reported in wartime records, strengthening the conclusion that USS Greyback had likely been destroyed during the attack documented by Japanese aircraft crews decades earlier. The rediscovery, therefore, did not simply reveal the location of the submarine, but also connected surviving physical evidence to historical accounts that had remained only partially trusted for generations. Records once viewed as uncertain fragments of wartime reporting suddenly gained renewed credibility when matched against the physical condition of the wreck itself. The rediscovery of USS Greyback transformed what had once appeared to be an unsolvable wartime disappearance into a case shaped heavily by historical interpretation failure. Unlike submarine mysteries defined by total absence of evidence, this case demonstrated how information can exist within archival systems for decades while still remaining effectively inaccessible because of a small but consequential analytical error. The submarine's disappearance had persisted not because there were no records, but because the records themselves had quietly redirected understanding away from the truth. Within naval history, the submarine became an unsettling example of how inaccurate translation can redirect entire generations of investigation away from the truth. The ocean concealed USS Greyback physically, but the greater obstacle to discovery proved to be the accepted certainty surrounding the wrong coordinates. For decades, the submarine rested beneath Pacific waters, while historians, naval researchers, and search teams operated under assumptions shaped by a single, mistaken conversion buried deep within wartime documentation. USS Greyback had not vanished beyond discovery, but beyond the limits of an error hidden inside the record searching for it. The lost Soviet submarine K-278 Komsomolets. Titanium pressure hull engineering gave K-278 Komsomolets operating depth capabilities far beyond those normally associated with Cold War-era nuclear submarines, allowing it to descend to depths that placed it among the most advanced underwater vessels ever constructed. Developed as part of a highly specialized Soviet naval program, the submarine's design emphasized extreme pressure resistance through the use of a titanium hull, a feature that distinguished it from most other attack submarines of its era and symbolized a technological ambition aimed at pushing operational limits far beneath the ocean's surface. In theory, this capability allowed K-278 to operate in regions of the deep ocean inaccessible to conventional naval forces, creating a strategic advantage defined by depth, concealment, and environmental endurance. Soviet naval planners viewed such submarines as critical strategic assets, capable of surviving in operational zones where enemy detection systems became increasingly unreliable, and the submarine's remarkable depth tolerance was intended not only as a defensive advantage, but as evidence of Soviet engineering capable of rivaling or exceeding Western submarine development during the later stages of the Cold War. Arctic patrol conditions surrounding K-278 initially reflected stable operational movement beneath the cold waters of the Norwegian Sea during the submarine's final deployment cycle, where submerged navigation proceeded under controlled and routine monitoring conditions. The vessel was operating within the Northern Fleet's area of responsibility during a period of Cold War naval activity, in which submarines frequently traversed isolated maritime corridors under ice-influenced weather systems and low-temperature ocean layers. Within this environment, K-278 performed as expected in its early operational phase, maintaining depth stability and system integrity, while navigating submerged patrol routes far from immediate surface contact or external observation. Arctic submarine operations demanded extraordinary precision because environmental conditions in northern waters imposed constant strain on machinery, sensors, and navigation systems, particularly in regions where cold temperatures affected equipment reliability and surface weather could change rapidly enough to complicate emergency response planning. Interior conditions aboard Soviet nuclear submarines during extended deployments were already physically demanding even before emergencies developed, with crews operating inside confined compartments dominated by mechanical vibration, fluctuating temperatures, restricted movement, and continuous procedural discipline. Personnel aboard K-278 lived within narrow passageways lined with electrical systems, pipes, valves, and reactor support infrastructure where nearly every section of the vessel served both operational and survival purposes simultaneously. Fire represented one of the most feared onboard threats because submarine compartments contained dense concentrations of machinery, wiring, insulation material, and atmospheric circulation systems capable of distributing smoke and toxic gases throughout enclosed sections with alarming speed. Within such environments, even localized ignition events could rapidly evolve into vessel-wide emergencies if containment systems failed to isolate the affected area quickly enough. Smoke began spreading through aft engineering compartments after fire erupted inside internal cable and machinery sections deep within the submarine, marking the beginning of a rapid internal escalation that would define the vessel's final hours. The ignition source was later associated with electrical and mechanical systems located in engineering spaces where high-energy equipment operated in tightly confined conditions, and once combustion began, the enclosed environment of the submarine allowed heat and smoke to circulate with limited dissipation pathways. Unlike open environments where fire can be contained through ventilation and external suppression, submarine interiors concentrate heat and toxic gases accelerating the transformation of a localized failure into a vessel-wide emergency. Initial reports suggested that flames and smoke moved quickly through cable routes and interconnected engineering sections, creating overlapping system failures that complicated both containment and communication efforts almost immediately after the emergency began. Automatic emergency systems aboard K-278 were activated as crew members attempted to contain the fire before it compromised propulsion and reactor-related systems, initiating a structured response designed to isolate affected compartments and preserve critical operational integrity. These systems included compartment sealing mechanisms, ventilation adjustments, and emergency protocols intended to prevent fire spread into reactor-adjacent areas, where secondary failure could escalate into far more severe consequences. Despite these measures, the speed of smoke propagation and rising internal temperatures reduced the effectiveness of automated containment responses, forcing crew intervention in increasingly hazardous conditions. Soviet submarine emergency doctrine depended heavily on compartmentalization, where individual sections could theoretically be isolated to prevent cascading failure throughout the vessel, yet the practical success of these procedures depended on crews maintaining control under conditions where visibility, breathable air, and system reliability were all deteriorating simultaneously. Compartment isolation procedures temporarily slowed the progression of the onboard emergency, though rising heat and smoke continued spreading through interconnected sections of the vessel, creating conditions where visibility and breathable air rapidly deteriorated. Crew members moved through narrow passageways under emergency lighting, relying on procedural coordination to seal affected compartments while attempting to maintain access to critical control systems. However, as the fire developed, the balance between containment and accessibility became increasingly difficult to maintain, particularly as internal communications and environmental monitoring systems began to degrade under thermal and electrical stress. In submarine fires, smoke itself often becomes as dangerous as the flames, because enclosed circulation systems can distribute toxic combustion products throughout multiple compartments long before the full extent of the fire is visible to personnel farther forward in the vessel. Deep diving capability offered little protection once the internal fire began affecting electrical stability and atmospheric conditions throughout the submarine, revealing a critical limitation in which structural strength could not compensate for internal environmental failure. Although K-278 had been engineered for extreme external pressure resistance, its systems remained vulnerable to internal hazards such as fire, smoke, and electrical breakdown, which operate independently of hull integrity. As these internal conditions worsened, the submarine's design advantages became less relevant to immediate survival, shifting the focus of the crew from depth capability to basic life support preservation. The disaster exposed a paradox central to advanced submarine engineering, where vessels designed to withstand extraordinary external pressure can still be critically threatened by comparatively small ignition events occurring inside their own confined systems. Emergency ascent operations eventually brought K-278 toward the surface as onboard conditions became increasingly difficult to control below the Arctic waters, marking a transition from deep submerged operation to exposed surface vulnerability. The decision to surface reflected the escalating internal crisis, where continued underwater operation was no longer viable due to the combined effects of fire, smoke, and system instability. As the submarine rose, it moved from a protected underwater environment into one of direct exposure, where Arctic surface conditions introduced a new set of environmental threats beyond the original internal emergency. Surfacing a damaged submarine in northern waters did not end the crisis, but altered its nature entirely, because survival now depended not only on internal containment, but on maintaining structural stability against rough sea conditions and freezing temperatures. Violent exposure to freezing air and rough sea conditions transformed the surface submarine into an unstable environment where survival procedures became increasingly chaotic, as structural integrity continued to deteriorate under external Arctic pressure. The transition from submerged vessel to surface platform placed K-278 in direct contact with harsh environmental forces, including cold air temperatures, high waves, and unpredictable sea movement that complicated onboard coordination. What had begun as an internal mechanical emergency now extended into an external survival crisis, where the environment itself became a direct contributor to escalating danger. Accounts from the disaster later described conditions in which smoke, darkness, freezing wind, and rolling seas combined into a single, overwhelming operational environment that challenged the crew's ability to maintain organised evacuation and damage control procedures. Evacuation efforts placed surviving crew members into near-freezing Arctic waters, where hypothermia rapidly emerged as a second catastrophe beyond the fire itself, fundamentally altering the nature of survival away from the submarine. As personnel abandoned sections of the vessel, exposure to extreme cold water conditions created immediate physiological risk, with survival windows measured in minutes rather than hours. Life rafts and rescue efforts offered limited protection against the environmental severity, and the combination of physical exhaustion, cold shock, and delayed rescue response contributed to rapidly worsening survival conditions for those outside the submarine. Arctic water temperatures can incapacitate even healthy individuals extremely quickly, and many sailors entering the sea faced disorientation, impaired movement, and respiratory shock almost immediately after immersion. Survival conditions in the water deteriorated further as separation between crew members, life rafts, and rescue assets increased under rough sea movement surrounding the sinking submarine. Waves and cold exposure complicated efforts to maintain organised evacuation groups, while exhaustion from firefighting and emergency procedures reduced physical endurance among many survivors. Rescue operations in Arctic conditions are often constrained by the same environmental factors threatening survivors, including unstable visibility, freezing spray, heavy seas, and limited manoeuvrability around damaged vessels. For personnel already weakened by smoke inhalation or prolonged exposure inside the submarine, the transition into freezing open water represented a final stage of the disaster that many could not physically survive. Rescue operations unfolding around K278 struggled against severe environmental conditions that reduced the survivability window for sailors remaining in the water, as coordination between available vessels and survivors became increasingly constrained. The Arctic environment limited visibility and manoeuvrability, making it difficult for rescue teams to reach all individuals in time, while cold temperatures continued to reduce survival probabilities with each passing moment. Despite ongoing efforts, the gap between evacuation and effective rescue widened under environmental pressure that exceeded the operational capabilities of immediate response systems. Even after the submarine itself disappeared beneath the surface, the disaster continued through the prolonged struggle to retrieve survivors before hypothermia overtook them in the freezing sea. Progressive flooding and structural instability eventually forced K278 beneath the surface, despite prolonged attempts to preserve buoyancy after the evacuation phase, marking the final transition from damaged vessel to submerged wreck. As internal compartments filled with water and buoyancy systems failed under sustained stress, the submarine lost its ability to remain at the surface, descending into deep Arctic waters. This final descent was not the result of a single catastrophic moment, but the culmination of a sequence of failures initiated by fire, compounded by structural damage, and concluded under environmental pressure. The loss of K278 demonstrated how submarine disasters often evolve through overlapping crises rather than isolated events, where each stage weakens the vessel's ability to survive the next. Nuclear reactor systems and armed torpedoes descended with the submarine into deep ocean conditions that later generated long-term environmental concern among monitoring agencies, introducing a secondary layer of significance beyond immediate loss of life. The presence of nuclear material and weapons aboard K278 raised questions regarding long-term containment stability on the seafloor, particularly in relation to corrosion, environmental exposure, and potential leakage risks over extended periods. While immediate disaster response focused on crew survival, later attention shifted toward the enduring condition of the submerged wreck and its potential environmental implications. Unlike conventional wrecks, K278 remained significant long after sinking, because the materials resting within the submarine carried risks capable of extending decades beyond the original accident itself. Subsequent expeditions examining the wreck site detected continuing anxiety over possible radioactive leakage from sections of the submarine resting on the seafloor, reinforcing concerns that extended beyond the original disaster timeline. Scientific monitoring and naval assessments periodically revisited the site to evaluate structural integrity and containment stability, particularly given the submarine's nuclear reactor and weapon systems. Although no immediate large-scale environmental release was confirmed, The persistent uncertainty surrounding long-term containment has remained a defining aspect of K278's legacy. Deep-sea corrosion processes occur gradually but continuously, meaning that even stable wreck conditions can evolve unpredictably over long periods as pressure, seawater chemistry, and material degradation interact around the submerged reactor and weapon compartments. Cold War naval history ultimately remembered K278 not only for its extraordinary engineering achievements, but for how rapidly those advantages collapsed during a single onboard emergency, revealing the fragile boundary between technological advancement and operational vulnerability. The submarine's design represented one of the most ambitious engineering efforts of its era, yet its final outcome demonstrated how internal failures can override even the most advanced structural capabilities when compounded by fire, environmental exposure, and system-wide degradation. In this sense, K278 became not only a lost vessel, but a reference point in understanding the limits of deep-diving submarine resilience. Modern assessments of the disaster continue balancing admiration for the submarine's technical design against unresolved concerns surrounding what still remains inside the wreck, particularly in relation to long-term environmental stability and containment reliability. Decades after the sinking, K278 remains on the seabed as both a technological landmark and a continuing subject of environmental monitoring, reflecting the dual legacy of innovation and risk embedded within its construction and loss. Under the Norwegian Sea, K278 Komsomolets still rests with the reactor and weapons that survived the disaster continuing above it. Shadows beneath the ice, the fate of USS Stickleback. Naval exercise formations in the Pacific placed USS Stickleback within coordinated submarine surface ship training operations designed to simulate anti-submarine warfare conditions under controlled peacetime protocols, where submarines and escort vessels repeatedly practiced detection, tracking, and evasion maneuvers in a structured environment intended to replicate combat pressure without the presence of actual wartime threat. Within these exercises, precision in timing and positioning was critical because multiple vessels operated in close proximity, while submerged contact was deliberately maintained at controlled distances. USS Stickleback was part of this framework, moving through submerged lanes of activity where coordination between sonar tracking, maneuvering instructions, and planned interception routes defined the flow of the exercise. Training exercises of this kind were considered essential during the Cold War period because submarine warfare increasingly depended on rapid underwater detection and response capability, particularly as naval powers attempted to refine techniques for tracking vessels operating below the surface without direct visual confirmation. Submerged naval exercises often carried hidden risks despite their controlled appearance, because sonar interpretation, underwater positioning, and maneuver timing depended on crews making accurate decisions inside environments where visibility was almost non-existent. Unlike surface operations where nearby vessels can be visually identified and distances estimated directly, submarines navigating underwater relied heavily on instruments, acoustic interpretation, and procedural coordination to avoid dangerous proximity. Small navigational miscalculations or delayed course corrections could quickly reduce separation between vessels operating beneath the surface, particularly during exercises involving simulated pursuit or evasive movement. Although these drills were designed to improve operational readiness, they also placed submarines and escort vessels within conditions where reaction time could become dangerously limited if communication or positional awareness failed even briefly. During one submerged maneuver phase, an unexpected underwater collision disrupted USS Stickleback's structural balance, immediately affecting hull integrity and forcing the crew to initiate emergency procedures while still beneath the surface. The impact occurred during a training sequence in which multiple vessels were operating in the same general area, and the exact sequence of contact would later be analysed through operational reports and after-action assessments. What was immediately clear, however, was that the submarine had sustained damage significant enough to compromise its ability to continue submerged operations safely, creating an urgent need to transition toward emergency ascent. Collision incidents involving submarines are particularly dangerous because underwater contact concentrates force directly against hull structures designed primarily to resist external pressure, rather than sudden lateral impact, meaning even survivable collisions can rapidly destabilize buoyancy and internal system reliability. Surfacing occurred under damaged conditions, bringing USS Stickleback into open visibility, where nearby naval units could directly assess the extent of structural impairment in real time. As the submarine broke the surface, escort vessels participating in the exercise were able to establish immediate visual contact, confirming that the vessel was no longer operating under standard training parameters. This moment marked a shift in the exercise environment, as a controlled simulation of naval engagement was replaced by a genuine emergency unfolding in plain sight. Unlike many submarine losses that occur invisibly beneath the surface, the crisis surrounding USS Stickleback unfolded within direct observational range of surrounding ships, creating a rare situation where the transition from operational control to instability could be witnessed as it happened. Visual confirmation from escort vessels revealed that the submarine had sustained damage significant enough to require external assistance before any continuation of movement or redeployment could be considered. Observers noted that the hull had been compromised in a way that made independent navigation uncertain, prompting immediate coordination between nearby ships to determine how best to stabilize the situation. At this stage, USS Stickleback was no longer functioning as an active training unit, but as a disabled vessel requiring direct operational support. Damage assessment aboard submarines following collision events is often complicated by the fact that structural compromise may not be fully visible externally, particularly when flooding or internal deformation occurs inside compartments inaccessible during emergency conditions. Assisted movement began shortly after, with USS Stickleback taken under controlled towing arrangements as participating ships attempted to stabilize its trajectory across the Pacific surface. The transition from submerged exercise participant to surface-towed vessel required rapid reorganization of operational priorities as escort ships shifted from simulated tactical roles to emergency recovery support. Towing lines were deployed and navigation adjustments were made to ensure that the submarine could be moved safely despite uncertainty regarding the extent of internal damage. Naval towing procedures involving damaged submarines require careful balance because towing speed, wave motion, and directional tension can place additional stress on already weakened structures, especially if internal flooding has altered the vessel's weight distribution. Recovery coordination between assisting vessels introduced additional complexity as crews attempted to maintain controlled movement while continuously reassessing USS Stickleback's changing condition. Surface support teams had to monitor towline stability, sea conditions, hull behavior, and communication updates simultaneously, while adapting to the possibility that the submarine's structural condition could worsen unexpectedly. In maritime recovery operations, even relatively calm conditions can become hazardous when damaged vessels begin shifting unpredictably under tow, because water entering compromised sections can alter balance faster than external support crews are able to compensate. This created an increasingly fragile operational situation in which the submarine remained afloat, yet no longer fully predictable. Water intrusion gradually intensified within compromised compartments, introducing instability that was not immediately apparent from external observation during the early phase of recovery. Internally, structural damage caused by the collision began allowing seawater to enter sections of the submarine that were critical to maintaining buoyancy control. While surface conditions suggested a managed recovery, the internal environment of USS Stickleback was evolving independently, driven by pressure differentials and weakened structural barriers. Flooding within submarines often progresses unevenly, creating dangerous shifts in internal balance that may not immediately appear externally until buoyancy degradation becomes severe enough to alter the vessel's visible posture in the water. As towing continued, internal flooding progressed beyond initial expectations, weakening the submarine's buoyancy in ways that were difficult to counter from surface support alone. The gradual loss of internal stability created a situation in which external assistance could not fully compensate for the changing weight distribution within the hull. Despite ongoing towing efforts, the submarine's internal condition continued to degrade in parallel with its movement across the surface. What made the situation particularly dangerous was that recovery operations themselves depended on the assumption that the submarine's structural integrity would remain stable long enough for relocation or repair support, an assumption that became increasingly uncertain as flooding intensified. Radio exchanges between USS Stickleback and assisting vessels began reflecting growing uncertainty as onboard stability shifted more rapidly than recovery teams could compensate for. Communication during this phase indicated that conditions aboard the submarine were becoming increasingly unpredictable, with reports suggesting that internal damage was affecting both control systems and physical integrity. These exchanges became central to later reconstructions of the incident, as they documented the transition from controlled recovery to emerging emergency. Communication during maritime emergencies often serves not only operational purposes, but also historical reconstruction, because fragmented radio traffic can become the clearest surviving record of how quickly stability deteriorated during final stages of crisis. Structural failure accelerated mid-recovery, transforming what had been a controlled assistance operation into an uncontrolled emergency, developing in real time. The shift occurred faster than procedural adjustments could be implemented, reducing the effectiveness of towing operations that had initially been designed to stabilize the submarine. At this stage, USS Stickleback was no longer simply a damaged vessel under assistance, but a failing structure undergoing progressive loss of control. The compressed timeline of this deterioration distinguished the incident from slower-moving naval disasters, because there was little separation between the recovery phase and the onset of irreversible failure. Loss of buoyant support occurred while escort ships were still in close proximity, placing the final phase of the incident directly within observable range of recovery personnel. The submarine's descent began in conditions where external vessels were actively engaged in attempting to maintain its stability, yet the internal flooding had reached a point where structural balance could no longer be preserved. This proximity between rescue effort and final failure created one of the most immediate and visually documented losses in post-war submarine operational history. Witnessing a submarine sink during active recovery operations produced a different psychological effect from disappearances occurring at sea without observation, because crews nearby could see the progression of failure while remaining unable to reverse it. Post-incident reviews focused on the interaction between collision damage and towing stress, particularly how combined forces exceeded the limits of emergency surface handling procedures. Investigators examined whether the structural compromise sustained during the collision had been exacerbated by subsequent towing strain, and whether different procedural decisions might have altered the outcome. The analysis emphasized that multiple factors converged within a short time frame, leaving little operational margin for correction once degradation began. Later naval safety studies would increasingly examine how damaged submarines behave during surface towing conditions, particularly in relation to balance instability and progressive flooding dynamics. Operational reports later emphasized that the transition from control to failure happened within a compressed time frame that left minimal opportunity for corrective response. Unlike submarine losses that unfold over extended periods or at extreme depth, this incident occurred within a surface recovery environment where all major developments were visible yet still too rapid to manage effectively. The speed of escalation became one of the defining characteristics of the event. What appeared externally as a manageable towing operation concealed an internal structural deterioration, advancing faster than recovery procedures were designed to address. Within naval safety documentation, USS Stickleback is frequently cited as a case where assistance operations themselves became part of the conditions leading to loss. The interaction between damage, towing stress, and time-sensitive structural failure created a scenario in which recovery procedures and failure progression overlapped in ways that were difficult to fully anticipate. As a result, the incident has been studied not only as a collision event but as a case study in the limits of emergency surface salvage operations. The disaster demonstrated that visibility, coordination, and immediate response do not necessarily guarantee recoverability once submarine stability begins deteriorating beyond controllable limits. Historical assessments consistently note that the submarine's final moments unfolded not in isolation, but under direct observation from vessels attempting to save it. The presence of multiple ships, coordinated communication, and active recovery measures did not prevent the outcome, but instead framed it within a highly visible operational context where the failure could be tracked second by second. This visibility, rather than reducing uncertainty, highlighted how rapidly control can dissolve even in managed conditions. The loss of USS Stickleback, therefore, became associated not with disappearance into hidden waters, but with the unsettling reality that even closely monitored recovery operations can still end in irreversible loss. USS Stickleback did not disappear into depth or distance, but transitioned from recovery to loss, while still being physically guided by the ships attempting to keep it afloat.